Hi, I'm Lira and this is tropetrinitytrilogy, and today I will be reviewing Zenith by Sasha Alsberg and Lindsay Cummings. I know this review is a bit late, but I hope you like it.
Hope is a raging asshole.
Shut up, Gilly. This book came out quite a while ago and it blew up booktube when it did. However, instead of reviewing it when it first came out and was relevant, I decided to wait 4 years to review it when no one gave a crap. Genius. So to give you the general gist of this book, it is a young adult space opera written in third-person perspective that hops between 6 different perspectives. So there's a lot. So I'm gonna read the blurb off Goodreads. Most know Androma Rosella as the Bloody Baroness, a powerful mercenary whose reign of terror stretches across the Mirabel galaxy. To those aboard her glass starship Marauder, however, she's just Andi, their friend and fearless leader. But when a routine mission goes awry, the Marauder's all-girl crew is tested as they find themselves in a treacherous situation at the mercy of a sadistic bounty hunter from Andi's past. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, a ruthless ruler waits in the shadows of the planet Zentera, biding her time to exact revenge for the destruction of her people. The pieces of her deadly plan are about to fall into place, unleashing a plot that will tear Mirabel in two. Andi and her crew embark on a dangerous, soul-testing journey that could restore order to their ship or just as easily start a war that will devour worlds. As the Marauder hurtles towards the unknown and Mirabel hangs in the balance, the only certainty is that in a galaxy run on lies and illusion, no one can be trusted. Ta-da! This seems a lot more high stakes than the book I got, but okay. But anyway, these are my 10 main points about the book, and I can't move my forearms right, and I know the noise is annoying, but I'm committed. I braided my hair, I got the cheekbones done, the arm cuffs, and I got all the purples. Oh, also I forgot, she wears red fingernail polish, so I'm full in character, so deal with it. Anyway, these are my 10 main points about the book. This is a book crammed with similes, like the Dark Matter pub is crammed with alcoholics. Number 2, world building as messy as General Cyprian Cortaz's plan. Number 3, as many perspectives as there are Solaran ice wolves in a pack. Number 4, Andi is as charming as a Zenteran carriage slug, with her stab you in the balls and laugh at you as you scream eyes. That second part is a quote from Dex about her. Number 5, Lira, her best friend, is almost as obnoxious as Andi. That counts as a simile, right? Because I used the word as. No, I couldn't think of one. Number 6, Dex is as consistently written as the Marauder is indestructible. So, not at all. Number 7, Nor is as awesome and deadly as an electric whip, until the book decided she was pure evil and then she became basic. Number 8, the book cannot decide between intense, morally gray written work or black and white morality where the good guys are always good and the bad guys are always bad. Insert bad simile here. Number 9, the plot and pacing is as mediocre as Dex's fighting abilities. Number 10, the book is as fun as a cool glass of spiced Rigna. So if you're thinking right now, Laura, those similes don't make any sense and they're real bad. Well, that's good because now you have a feel of what the writing style of this book is. Okay, but to give you a quick summary of my overall review on the book, this book has some good ideas for the world and the characters, but the execution is a mess. The book kind of just randomly info dumps some facts at the beginning and not even all the ones you would need to know, and then it just never talks about it again, so you have no clue what's happening until later on when random things being mentioned eventually start to make sense and you kind of get the gist of it. The characters have interesting backstories, but they don't have consistent personalities, and I can't stand the protagonist. Though I will say the villain is pretty cool and I like her despite the execution of her character being flawed, especially in the second half of the book. There are too many POVs, which never confused me, but it did result in characters lacking meaningful relationships. Because instead of me learning about Andi's best friend and pilot or her love interest through Andi interacting with them and them actually showing their relationships to the readers. Instead, the book just head hopped to those characters so I could learn about them from their perspective. If I'm only learning about Lira one with Lira, Andi one with Andi, Dex one with Dex, they feel like they're all in separate bubbles and I'm not invested in their relationships or in them as characters due to their lack of meaningful relationship. There are also double standards for the good guys and the villains, which I always find frustrating to read. I'm fine with morally gray protagonists who do bad things, but when the protagonist does tons of bad things, but she's redeemable because she feels bad about, but then the villain does something similar or even doesn't even do as many bad things before the halfway point, and the villain's described as evil and dark, whereas the protagonist is like, she still has a soul. I'm like, really? And also, the plot of the book does not justify the length of it. And I feel like a lot of it is due to the many POVs and the repetitiveness of some of them. I will say I did have fun listening to this book, but it is definitely shallow entertainment. And honestly, I don't know if I would have had as much fun if I had to open it and read it, meaning I would have to take free time out of my day to read it instead of listening to it while doing other things. I definitely had to turn my brain off to enjoy this book. But at the end of the day, the writing craft, world building, characters, and plot are all 1 star. And you could probably find a better YA adventure in space if you looked for it. So I showed my friend a pic and she couldn't see my silver cheekbones with makeup, so I just added tinfoil to my face as per her suggestion. So I hope you appreciate this added look, especially because my voice is echoing off the tinfoil back at me and it's very confusing. And so I really don't highly recommend this, but if you want to chill, sit back, relax, read, I do recommend the audiobook. It can be fun at times. If you aren't too worried about how flawed the book is and just want some cool space action, you might enjoy it. Now let's break down these points in a more detailed analysis. Beware, because now there are spoilers. The writing in this book is not very good. This book comes across as 2 authors who naturally have very straightforward writing, trying to come across as artsy, and do so by forcing a simile into every other sentence. Not just a metaphor, specifically similes, preferably with like. Everything is like something. However, this is sci-fi, so let's not just have similes. Let's have similes to sci-fi things from this world. But better yet, sci-fi things from this world, but that we have not explained to the reader, so it makes no sense. My personal favorite simile was in chapter 4, during a chase scene between 2 ships, when Dex thought,
"Here I am," the ship seemed to say, "large and in charge and as undercover as a Zen-Terran carriage slug."
And then it proceeds to go back into the chase scene. That sentence is very large and clunky, and what should be a fast-paced, intense chase scene is cluttered with chunky sentences like that. It doesn't feel like a high-speed chase at all, which, I mean, it also doesn't feel like a high-speed chase because it happens for like multiple chapters with a random chapter slapped in the middle that is a character that's not even involved in the chase. So yeah, it's a very slow-paced chunk. However, not all of the similes make no sense. Some of them are multiple cliches at once. For example, at one point, the general is described as having a smile like a Solarian ice wolf. Or was it eyes like a Solarian ice wolf? Doesn't matter. The point is, one of his smile or his eyes, something about his face is like a Solarian ice wolf. So we get the cliche of an icy gaze or appearance, which is like very stony and serious and deadly. And then we get the wolfish one, which is like very cunning and trickstery and also deadly. Because we can't have an icy gaze, we can't just have a wolfish smile, we gotta have a Solarian ice wolf smile. Because, you know, gotta have the Solarian in the front too to get that random sci-fi thing we don't know. Amazing. And also, I would like to add, later on near the end of the book, someone or something is compared to a flaming whip. When there are actual electric whips in this sci-fi world, used by the characters in the sci-fi world multiple times, and it's like the one time you had a perfect sci-fi world appropriate metaphor set up, you say flaming whip. Oh, also there's a line in chapter 17 that says prisoners were there for life or until death took them. Beautiful. Beautiful. When I first started reading this book, I felt like Dex's chapters were especially clunky and awkwardly written. The worst line of dialogue I ever heard, which was in his first chapter, was,
"You," he said, glaring at the youngling between his fingers, "will do yourself a favor and go to the passenger bay so you can crap your pants in private. I can smell your fear from here." Now, eventually, the quality of Dex's chapters did improve, and it matched the quality of all the other chapters. And I do think the quality of the writing actually did improve throughout the book as it got further along. But that beginning should have been edited way more, and you can tell this book was rushed. However, I can tell that the book was originally intended to be episodic. The chapters keep explaining the same things over and over again, and it gets annoying. However, there is one infamous line in this book that I do have to acknowledge, and that is,
Hope is a raging asshole.
So many reviewers have made fun of that line and criticized it, but I'm here with an unpopular opinion. I think that line is perfectly fine. So this line is said by Gilly, a 13-year-old pirate who just started adding curse words to her vocabulary. And this is the full quote.
Hope is all we have. Hope is a raging asshole, Gilly said. Explain to me, Gilly, Breck said with a sigh. How exactly can an asshole rage? Lira choked on a sudden, unexpected laugh.
This is said by a 13-year-old who just started cursing. It's kind of like, yeah, I'm getting away with it. So of course it makes sense she would curse excessively when she doesn't need to, in ways that are kind of dumb and don't make sense, and end up sounding silly. And the older characters point out how dumb of a statement it is. Like, if you can't have your 13-year-old twerp character say a stupid sentence and then have your other characters in the book make fun of it without the entire internet pointing at that line being like, ha, you suck at writing, that's terrible. Like, no silly writing for you. Maybe defending Hope as a raging asshole is not the best way to come across as a reliable or good book reviewer, but this is the hill I chose to die on, and so I'm ready to die. Number 2. The world building in this book is not very good. A lot of the world building is actually just straight up told in similes that don't make sense. Or it's just spacey weird things shoved into the book without explanation. Now, if you're into hardcore sci-fi, be warned, these authors don't seem to know anything about it. They just give weapons spacey names like Big Bang, or tobacco a spacey name like Moon Chew to make it feel like a space opera. These alien species are not the most thought out, and most of them are not explained at all. The species in this book could be a lot more creative because they're all pretty much humans with one difference. For example, the protagonist Andi is from Arcadius, the asshole good guy planet, and she is exactly like a human. Okay, that's fine. But then Queen Noor, who is from Zentera, the dying bad guy planet, she is also exactly like a human. And at that point, I'm just like, I cannot tell the difference between these two species. The aliens being suspiciously similar doesn't ruin this as a fluffy space opera that's just meant to be fun and full of action, but it does show a lack of creativity. And there are also some scientific inaccuracies within this world, like radiation giving off sci-fi powers, but that's a common one, and I'm like, you know, whatever. And then there's one where, like, this character, she gets shot by bullets. They flatten against her skin and fall because she's bulletproof instead of ricocheting off her skin like real bulletproof things. Which, like, I know bothered a lot of people, and it's not my favorite thing, but it's not really that big in the story. And I'm like, I get it, you're trying to do the role of cool. It's not a big deal. But what does bother me is the inconsistencies within the logic of the story. Like, you can flatten bullets all you want as long as you're consistent about it. Like, the guns that were shooting the character earlier with bullets were said to be shooting energy, not bullets. So it's not relevant. Why are there bullets flattening on her skin? The guns aren't supposed to be shooting bullets. And also, that same character who is bulletproof then gets hit by the butt of a gun in the nose and gets a nosebleed. I'm like, what you're telling me is that hunks of metal being shot at ridiculous speeds fast enough to break through flesh and bone all the way through, that can't break your skin. But someone using their physical human strength to hit you in the nose with the butt of a gun, that gives you a nosebleed. Okay. However, I would argue my biggest issue with the world building is how it is expressed to the reader, because the politics behind the world is actually pretty interesting, and I think it could be cool. Like, it's a cool idea. But this is never really explained in a timely or cohesive way. It's like you get bits and pieces of things just sprinkled in, like they'll name one planet, then they'll name another, and you're like, well, I forgot what that planet was already. And the whole religion of the god stars, which there's only one religion for all the planets in the solar system, so you think that it would be pretty easy to explain the single religion in your book. But that religion is literally never explained for most of the book, with the characters just saying, good god stars, may the god stars guide us, stuff like that. And then at the very end of the book, there's an entire info dump about the god stars and how they created the galaxy and all this stuff. And I'm just like, what? And it remains irrelevant for the rest of the story. One thing I will say that's positive about the world building, though, is that when the characters land on planets, they are very well described and distinct. Number 3, this book has 6 POV characters. And you might think, wow, that's a lot. This book must be loaded with characters. But not really. About half of the characters in this book get their own perspective. I think there's only like 8 characters that get names who don't get a POV, and a lot of them aren't even in the book that much. They're like just there for a couple scenes. In my opinion, the only characters in this book who should have got a perspective are Andi and Queen Noor. And honestly, the only one who actually needed a perspective was Andi. It's just, I liked Queen Noor's perspective, and I liked how it made her a more interesting villain, and I know if she didn't get her own perspective, she would be a basic villain. But the biggest issue with the multiple point of views is that Lira and Dex are pretty much always with Andi, and after the first third of the book, Valen is also always with them too. So a lot of their perspectives are redundant. A scene will play out from Andi's perspective, and then the ending will be repeated from Lyra's perspective again. Also, these perspectives aren't well written. Especially for Dex's and Andi's chapters, they constantly flip between their 2 point of views. This book did not need to head hop mid-chapter. In chapter 6, it goes from Dex to Andi to Dex. In chapter 17, it goes from Andi to Dex. In chapter 28, it goes from Andi to Dex, Andi to Dex. The multiple perspectives hurt character relationships. Instead of me learning about Lira through her and Andi interacting and bonding, I just switched to Lira and learn about her from herself. My experience of their relationship is Andi thinking, we're friends, and then Lira thinking, we're friends, and I'm like, wow, great. There's not really much meaningful interactions between characters on the page. But with the characters that were always together, their characterization didn't feel consistent depending on the perspective. Number 4, I cannot stand Andi. So her backstory is actually pretty cool. A bit excessively long, but the main problem with this backstory is this book is YA. And in order to make Andi an appropriate YA age during the current part of the book, that means that in the backstory, she gets appointed as the one and only bodyguard to the heir to the entire planet at age 14, which is ridiculous. Especially because it stated she learns to fight when she's on the run with the bounty hunter Dex, which means you picked a 14-year-old who couldn't even fight that well to be your daughter's personal bodyguard. Really? Andi doesn't feel like an 18-year-old given her backstory. However, that is not why I can't stand Andi. That's just weird. The reason I can't stand Andi is because she's a murderer who has her actions justified because she feels bad about it. One moment she's feeling guilty and sad, and the next moment she gets mad during a fight and thinks things like the bloody baroness is out to play, and then proceeds to go on murder sprees. At the beginning of the book, Andi describes one of her and her crew's past missions, and
like the time they kidnapped a rich Solaran's mistress and left her on a meteor. The job requested by the man's furious wife. She paid a pretty penny for their services. It wasn't until days later that they found out the woman was not only a mistress, but a prominent politician's daughter from Tenebris. The politician tore the galaxy apart looking for his daughter. When he eventually found her withered corpse on that barren rock, word got back about who put her there.
This isn't self-defense or saving her crew. This is leaving someone to die by the elements on a planet for some money. Like, she could have even just gotten the money and then freed the woman. You didn't even have, she could have just lied to get the money. You're a pirate. At the beginning of the book, she thinks something that is something like 100 more deaths to cover the pain of the first. She thinks something like that. So you feel guilty at one death, and then you're just killing these other people because it makes you feel less bad about killing your friend by accident. It's like, Andi, you suck. Like, she feels bad about murdering multiple shiploads of people and cities of people, but not enough to stop. She just feels bad about it. She's not going to stop. She's just going to dream about dancing with them. It's like, also, she's like, I dream with the face of every person I kill, and I put a tally on my sword for every person I kill. I'm like, you blew up an entire ship. You don't know what their faces look like, and you don't know how many people were on there. So I call bullshit. You can't dream about all of them. There's too many bodies. However, Andi, being a garbage person, doesn't stop there. Don't you worry. Because when Dex confronts her about the many other murders she's committed, this girl has the audacity to blame him for her being a murderer. And the reason she blames him is because he trained her to fight. Not just because he trained her to fight, because he complimented her fighting ability. She literally imitates him and is like, oh, Andi, you're so good at fighting. Oh, Andi, you're amazing when you're in combat. Andi, it's your fault you decided to use that ability to leave women on meteors to die and blow up shiploads of people with kids as young as 15 on them. But don't worry, that's not the only time she does it. She also does it to Valen. So Valen is the brother of Kaylee, her best friend who she killed on the ship, in case you forgot. So Valen was in prison for 3 years being tortured, and he is emaciated and covered in lash marks from electric whips. He has suffered more than any other character in this entire book. So after he finally wakes up from being unconscious, everyone's just like, oh, he's so weird, he's so weird. And when he finally gets to be alone with Andi, he's like he's mad at her because he hasn't gotten to talk to her since she killed his sister. And he confronts her about it, is like, you're a murderer. And you know what this idiot, jerk, stupid snob does? She blames him. She's like, it's your fault Kaylee died too, because when we were sneaking out to steal the ship to go on a joyride, you came out and told us not to do it and said you would tell on us. And then after Kaylee belittled you and told you you sucked and you don't have any friends, and then you went, fine, well, don't blame me, and then goes and leaves. That's why it's his fault. Not because Andi knowingly stole a ship and took it for a joyride and he warned them not to do it. It's his fault too because he didn't physically stop them and go get the father. And like, yes, he knows that he could have stopped it and he feels guilty about it. But Andi, you've murdered so many people, and the moment you're confronted, like, she feels guilty about her friend dying. She talks about it all the time, but the moment someone's like, yeah, you did kill your friend, you should feel bad about it, she's like, no, it's your fault too. And then when he leaves all upset and she goes and finds him again and she sees how sad and depressed he is, she sees the guilt and self-loathing in his eyes for himself that she feels for herself, she's happy about it. She is happy to see that he feels just as shitty as she does, because she is a garbage person and I freaking hate Andi. And this hypocrisy paints the entire book. At one point, Dex is about to kiss Andi and he's thinking about how much he loves her, and then there's an attack, and later in the attack he ends up taking a suit from one of the bad people as a disguise And he's thinking about how disgusted he is to be wearing a murder suit. It's like, dude, you were just about to kiss Andi. I am 100% sure she's killed more people than that soldier has ever had in his life. Sorry, I ranted. I have strong feelings about this character. I really don't like her. Number 5. Lira is almost as obnoxious as Andi. So Lira isn't as bad as Andi, but she's still a hypocrite, and I'm calling out all the hypocrisy today. She's from a pacifist planet, so even though Lyra is part of the most ruthless crew in the galaxy, she doesn't kill. No, she just beats the shit out of them until they are unable to defend themselves, and then lets her crewmates kill them. Wow, so much better. And in case you forgot, she was the pilot responsible for
Weathered corpse.
But then, at one point in the book, Lira reunites with her brother, and he's like, don't worry, I know you're not a murderer. And I'm like, she is a murderer. Like, just because you didn't land the killing blow doesn't make you any less guilty. And I'm just annoyed because it's like, you're not a murderer, Lira. It's like, yes, you are. You left a woman to die on a meteor, and you beat the shit out of people so that they can't defend themselves and your crewmates can kill them, which you 100% are completely aware that that is what they're going to do with them. So no, Lira, you are a murderer. And I don't care if you didn't land the killing blow. You're just as guilty. And that whole, like, not landing the killing blow seems like some other bull crap, like what Andi does to make herself feel better about herself, when really she's still a garbage person. And also, I would like to add, I am fine with morally gray protagonists who do bad things. It's just I don't like how it's done in this book, because it feels like guilt is being used to excuse the actions, and the character never held accountable, because accountability is important when it comes to morally gray characters. If they don't have any accountability, then it just feels like the author's excusing their actions. Number 6. Dex is terribly written. Dex is probably the least consistent character I have ever read in my entire life. So at the beginning of the book, Dex is this badass with retractable Wolverine gloves to try to give the reader the impression he's this tough bounty hunter. But he never uses the gloves once in the book. They're just forgotten. It's like at one point he takes them off. It's like, can't bring them with me to this place, so make sure they don't get lost or I'll be really mad, and then they're never mentioned again. He's supposed to have trained Andi, but there's like one fight where he sort of does good, but it's not that impressive because she completely upstages him in every way. Bounty hunter character you set up really comes across the way you intended. But that does not even hold a candle to how inconsistent his personality is. In the first chapter, he's acting like he's all tough, how he wants to get revenge on Andi and how much he doesn't like her, and how he thinks his crew all sucks, and he's like telling this kid to go crap himself in private because he's so cool.
Crap your pants in private.
Yeah, Dex. So cool. Then in the next chapter, he stands in the back, not fighting because, apparently he's a great fighter, but he doesn't fight. He just hides behind the entire crew as they get slaughtered, just standing in the back all cool, being like, Andi, good to see you again, Then he leads her to a trap and she gets captured. Then he's thinking, he's like, I don't care how the crew died, they sucked anyway, good riddance, I don't like them. So he's like this terrible person who feels less guilt than Andi. I'm like, wow, I thought Andi was bad, but no, this guy has no regard for human life, even if they're on his side. And he's just acting all smug at Andi, and then when he's forced to work with her, he's upset and wants nothing to do with her, but then he continues to act smug and be a bit flirty just to get under her skin and make her upset. So you're like, oh, he's a terrible, immoral person. But then in the next chapter, from Andi's point of view, he feels guilty and is begging her to hear his side of the story. It's like, when did this happen? When? In chapter 24, from Andi's perspective, Dex is begging her to hear his side of the story, to hear his perspective about why he betrayed her, to try to make amends because he cares about her. And he's whining to this woman he promised to have sex with that he can't have sex with her because he cares about Andi. Then in chapter 25, he's daydreaming about how he wishes he was with some soft-skinned, gentle woman as a lover, and he's looking at Andi who's covered in blood from killing people, and he's like grossed out. He's like, of course I'm stuck with this murderer. And she shoves a key in a guard's eye and he's disgusted. He's judging her. He's like, what the heck? That is messed up. Despite not ever flinching when she murdered his entire crew. Speaking of his entire crew that she murdered, in this chapter he finally decides to mourn them. They were killed in chapter 6. That was 19 chapters ago. And originally he was like, yeah, good riddance. But now, 19 chapters later, he's mourning them? Really? Really, Dex? Like, is this the same person? Because no, the Dex at the beginning of the book is a completely different person. I guess Dex cares about human life now. Could have fooled me. And then in that same chapter, he thinks about how much he loves to be beside Andi. And then in chapter 27, Dex chuckles when Andi chops a man's hand off. Okay, like you just were horrified by the eye thing, but hands, chop them all off. In chapter 42, when the ship is crash landing on a planet, Dex is cheering like he's on a ride. And then in chapter 43, he's thinking about how much he hates the feeling of weightlessness and literally says, this is not my idea of fun. So it wasn't even like he was pretending to be having fun to act cooler, but really hated it. No, he just decided to change his mind. Also, Dex's voice actor has a really deep voice, and when he voice acts Dex, he kind of goes this like voice. Now, I'm not making fun of the voice actor. He does a good job and he has a nice voice. But in chapter 6, there is a line Andi says that is also from her perspective, so it really shouldn't have been his voice actor narrating it. But of course, they head hop mid-chapter. But anyway, there is a line that Andi says, and this is how it's narrated.
What's wrong, Dex? You don't want to come out and play with me? Andi said, her voice a dangerous purr.
Baby voice. A grown man doing a baby voice trying to sound like a deadly woman. That's what I'm here for, audiobooks. Number 7. Noor is the best character in the book, and she's honestly one of my favorite villains. So I, as I said before, was rooting for Noor to win for most of the book. And even actually kind of after she became pure evil, because at that point I was just like, I just want them all to die. Noor is the epitome of a morally gray complex villain, except they kind of fumbled the second half. We saw through Noor's perspective pretty consistently throughout the beginning of the book, the first 2/3. And she was very complex. She grew up on the dying planet of Zentera, destroyed even more by the cataclysm, where on the final days of the cataclysm, at age 12, the castle she lived in was bombed, the rubble falling and crushing her father's head right in front of her when she was buried alive and almost died and lost her arm in the attack. After that event, she, growing up, and even now, she's plagued with nightmares of her father's death and being buried alive, and she's ashamed of her prosthetic arm, feeling imperfect, and she's really complex and has the most tragic backstory of all the characters in the book, like way more tragic than Andi's. I mean, maybe Gilly's is as tragic, but the authors don't actually care about Gilly's backstory, so it's pretty non-existent. Noor constantly thinks about how much she loves her people and how upset she is at their suffering and how she wants to save them. Her evil plan is literally the only thing anyone in the entire galaxy is doing to try to prevent a planet-wide extinction of the Zenterans. And yes, she does terrible things, but as far as I can tell, she's still responsible for less deaths than Andi. At least by the beginning of the book. And she also has a better reason for what she does than Andi. Noor doesn't focus on guilt. Instead, she focuses on the love of her people. Noor is like, I love my people. I don't want them to suffer. Like, those are her thoughts, the main driving force of her. And as the book went on, Noor did go from being more motivated by protecting her people and survival to power and revenge, which is fine. It could have been a cool moral decline. But instead, it felt like she had been evil all along, and all this stuff about her caring about her people. Whoops, we didn't mean to make her so morally gray and better justified than the protagonist. So let's just throw some words into the writing that makes her seem more bad. There's this one speech she gives to her people where she's trying to motivate them so they can rise up and not all go extinct. And she's like, hey, I've been through suffering too. I know what it's like to suffer and feel lost because I've been part of the cataclysm too. And she takes off her prosthetic arm, something she is normally like ashamed of, but she does it in front of all the people and like drops on the ground and is like, I'm like you, I've suffered like you. And it's great. Like, the people are all cheering, and it's 100% true. She has suffered. She has nightmares about the loss of her father. She does genuinely care about them. And after this great moving speech that riles up her people to try to fight to survive, the book is like, she lied. I'm like, bitch, where? Where's the lie? That was 100% true to everything you showed me about her, so why is it a lie now? And I'm like, oh wait, they decide she's a villain now. Before she was morally complex, they were like, oh crap, too morally complex, she's a villain now, we gotta put lie here. We can't let the reader agree with what she said, it's a lie. That moment, like, was a turning point for a character where they kept being like, describing her as dark and evil. I mean, the evil part was only from Andi's perspective, but it's like, really, Andi, you have the audacity to be calling other people evil after all the stuff you have done? She looks in Valen's eyes at the end during the climax, and she's just like, evil, there's evil eyes. I'm like, give me a break, Andi. Oh my god, you of all people should not be going evil at people. And I'm like, so was Nora's complexities never intended, and she was always meant to be dark and evil? And Nora does refer to herself as dark in her own narration, which is weird. Or did the authors just not know any other way to get us to root against her? So they're like, let's just start calling her evil. Then they'll know. Speaking of, this book cannot decide between having morally gray characters or black and white morality. So based on the actions of the characters and the history of the world, you think, oh, this is a great morally gray world for a lot of interesting questions and explorations, but then the way that everything is approached in the narrative, it's always is approached as black or white, which is extremely frustrating because you can have black and white morality, you can have morally gray morality, but when you have morally gray characters but you treat them as black or white, that's really frustrating to read. And now I have ranted about the characters, but now I'm going to rant about the unified systems versus the Olan system. Because the unified systems destroyed Nora's planet of Zentera. Those planets are shown to have an excess of wealth and resources. Also, the citizens of the unified systems who happened to be on Zentera at the time, they were just left there. They were banished from ever returning home, and so many of them ended up fighting for Zentera. Another reason why the unified systems don't seem that good. They just left their own people to die in a bombing they dropped on their heads. And for another spoiler, it's also revealed that Arcadius bombed Zentera after the Queen of Zentera signed a peace treaty during a ceasefire. So the war had literally already ended, but the general of Arcadius didn't sign it until he bombed an entire planet of innocent people, including children. And don't get me wrong, I understand why the general hated the queen and wanted her to suffer. Anyway, I get why he like cuts her tongue out and leaves her to die in the vacuum of space. Like, that's cool. Did you really need to blow up an entire planet of people because of one person's actions? It's not the entire planet of men, women, and children's fault. So it's like the general really isn't a good person at all. Like, I feel bad that the one bad thing happened to him, but he also still deserves to die. They just all deserve to die. They all suck. Except Nora. She's the best. They have these many celebrations that happen in the book about how they defeated Zentera, who is an entire planet where everyone's about to go extinct. And I'm just like, wow, like the good guys really aren't that good. This is pretty morally gray. Are we gonna have a morally gray story? No. Zentera is pure evil, and we're not gonna address how the good guys slaughtered them all because they're the good guys. Okay, well, you need to make a decision, authors, but apparently they didn't. There is a double standard, and it is frustrating because it's not a morally gray examination, it's just a straight up double standard. And also, for another tonal problem, background characters constantly die throughout the book, but the main characters, or literally every named character except one, have plot armor. Like, okay, 2 named characters don't have plot armor, but they're also super unimportant, and one is a general who no one likes, and the other one, they don't even mention the character by name when they're killed. And I saw a review where they didn't think that person died, and I'm like, no, they did die, it's just no one cares. But literally the plot armor is so strong that an android in the book is completely dismembered, and Andi happens to stumble upon his memory chip. So it's like, oh, he's not actually dead. She found the memory chip. It's like, great. I love the plot armor. This is supposed to be a dark, brittle world, but no one can die. That the authors like, so that's fine. Number 9. The plot and pacing of this book is not very good. So the plot of this book just straight up does not justify the length of it. The unnecessary POVs and the repetitiveness of the POVs add a lot of length to it. The beginning of this book is a multiple chapter long spaceship chase that has a random chapter from Claren, like before the characters were born. Great pacing. And then 1/3 of the way through the book, the climax that you expect the book to have of saving Valen is just completed. They save him without a single hitch in the plan, and you're like, oh, maybe the Zeniths will try to stop him and chase them down and attack them. It's like, nope, their ship just malfunctions for no apparent reason, just convenience, and they crash land on a planet, and then the entire middle of the book is about a subplot that never gets resolved. And it's a subplot about a side character, not even Andi. Great. And then the last third of the book, they get to the planet, and it's just all falling action until the very end when you realize, like, oh, Claren's backstory, Valen's her son, and then there's the climax, but it's not really built up to it. It's just falling. It's like, oh, climax, okay. And then the book ends. And like also with Valen being Claren's son, you're like, oh, you could do dramatic irony where the reader knows the whole time, and you're just like, oh, are they go figure it out in time? Are they go figure it out in time? Or you could do it as a plot twist where they don't find out until he stabs the general in the chest and admits it out loud. But instead this book decides to reveal it right before the climax, but only to the reader. It's not like Andi figures out, it's like, oh no, I need to stop it. It's, oh, by the way, this is the thing. If it was just Andi's perspective showing the main plot of the story, this would not even be a full novel. The general's plan is dumb. She killed his daughter, so why would he trust her to bring his only remaining child back home to him? That's stupid. Like, understand why she agrees to clear her record, which I don't really think she deserves to have her record cleared for saving one person considering she's murdered innocents, but I digress. I get why she agrees, but I don't get his plan at all. There are 2 reasons given in the book about why the general chooses Andi to save Valen, and I don't like either of them. But one is to avoid breaking the peace treaty, so he sends her because she's not affiliated with any planet because she's a criminal. So he sends her, she brings him back, and then he immediately has like an entire like broadcast where he puts Valen front and center. And it's like, oh, yeah, we have him. It's like, really? You don't think Zentara's gonna know? Even if they didn't, like, realize it from that, Andi is on the broadcast dancing with Valen. So, like, no. They know. Like, that's so stupid. The second reason that they gave is because Andi and her crew are expendable. But to get Andi to do the mission, 2 shiploads of people are killed in a bomb that Andi shoots at them, and then an entire crew is slaughtered by a crew in a fight. They expended way more lives getting Andi to do it instead of just getting someone they already had who was capable to do it with a group of people who are already capable. So the takeaway is the general plan is stupid and there's no good excuse. And another thing that's dumb is at the end of the book, to keep the pirates at the event, like, and so they can't just leave right away so they can be there for the climax, he's like, I'm extending your contract because I'm sneaky and you have to be my son's bodyguard through the entire event before you can leave. And they literally don't do any bodyguarding and they just use it as an excuse to party, and I'm like, great, so everything's just pointless. Finally, number 10. This book is fun. So this is the first audiobook I've listened to that I hadn't previously read before. The voice acting was very good. This book was fun to listen to while driving and cleaning and exercising and working and doing a bunch of different things at the same time. I'm not sure if I would feel the same way if I physically read it and had to take time out of my day to read it, because I do have a lot of issues with it, and I'm not sure if I would want to use up my free time reading something I have this many issues with. You might want to listen to it as a just chill thing to listen to, and maybe out of curiosity to see what it is up with the book. It was very campy with some fun action scenes. I liked the action scene in the prison where it was completely dark besides the electric whips they were using to fight that lit up the place. I thought that was a very cool and creative set for a fight, and I definitely appreciated that, and the planets were very well described despite my hatred of the protagonist. So in conclusion, I do think this book only got published because of Sasha Alsberg's popularity and the fact that when they published the little segment, it hit New York Times bestseller right away. But honestly, I'm not upset about that. That's perfectly reasonable. I mean, publishing is to spread art, but at the end of the day, they gotta sell books to make money and continue publishing. And when something's a surefire hit and profit maker like this, I don't blame them for publishing it. My issue is that they clearly cut corners when it came to putting this book out there. They didn't give the time for the book to be well written and edited. This book was one of the lowest standard traditionally published books I read. I understand picking up a not particularly great book because you know you can sell it, but at the end of the day, you need to improve that book to a better quality, at least a passable quality. Harley Quinn team just cut all the corners. They didn't care because they knew they could make the money. Sorry if that review was a bit harsh, but that's how I honestly feel. I don't really make rant reviews or label my reviews as rants really because I don't want to be mean, but that's just how the book made me feel. Anyway, what did you think of this book? Have you read it? Do you plan on reading it? Will you never read this? Please tell me all your thoughts below. Thank you for watching. I'm gonna go kill someone. But don't worry, I'll feel guilty about it, so I'm still a good person. Later!
Weathered corpse, 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 weathered corpse.
Hop is a raging asshole.